Hello, and welcome back to the world of Wysteria. Tonight, I will be reading Chapter 12. Wysteria, Chapter 12. This will be presented in two parts. As was his custom, Will began the day contemplating, analyzing what had taken place the night before in Wysteria. This morning, the strange behavior of the clock on the tower occupied his thoughts. Why were the hands frozen at first, he wondered. It was possible that the clock simply wasn't working yet, but it seemed more likely that it was. The hands didn't move because time wasn't moving, in the sense that the time of day wasn't changing. But then, why did the hands start to move after he'd reset the time on his pocket watch? That must have been the moment when the time of day began to change, he thought. Setting the watch didn't fix the clock in the tower. The hands on the clock began to move because time began to pass. Of course, time had always passed in Wysteria. That is, events had a temporal duration and sequence. So, what was it that changed at that moment, he asked himself. The answer, it seemed, was that the sun began traveling through the sky, which had been the point of creating the clock tower in the first place, to encourage the sun to set, bringing darkness to Wysteria. Though Will believed it was in his power to simply remove the sun and turn the sky dark, he wanted day to become night in a natural and predictable way. He wanted to know when night would come, how much daylight remained, and he wanted light to return to his world. His solution was to build the clock tower and use it to measure the passing of time, which, he hoped, would result in the setting and rising of the sun, day after day. Yes, his mind, not the clock, was responsible for this transformation of the environment. But Will had reasoned that the steady, mechanical movement of a timepiece would help his mind regulate the motion of the sun, or perhaps the rotation of the planet. For his mind would expect the sun to move to the west as the hours ticked by on the clock. Last night, once he saw the clocks were ticking, Will assumed that the sun had begun traveling. But for a time, since the sun moved so slowly, and there was no obvious reference point in the open sky, he couldn't be certain. I should have marked the position of the shadows in the square, he now thought. He would have known very quickly whether his plan was working. Actually, instead of a clock tower, I could have built a sundial. Given his objective, it would be more logical to use a method of measuring time that was directly linked to the sun's movement. Wait, he said, suddenly sitting up in bed. That man I met in the garden last night. He mentioned something about a sundial. At the time, though puzzled by the seemingly random comment, Will was too absorbed in contemplating his successful manipulation of the world to give it much thought. He'd supposed the stranger simply meant that a sundial would be a nice feature in the town. Who was that man, he thought? Like the blonde woman, he had initiated the encounter, and like Lily, his demeanor seemed less passive, more independent than that of the other people in the town. But there was no reason to think he was anything other than a character in his dream, except for that strange remark about the sundial. Could he really have understood why I built the clock tower, he wondered? If that gentleman were his creation, then, in a sense, he would have access to Will's mind. However, his other citizens had paid little or no attention to the large stone structure that had spontaneously appeared in their town overnight. Will had noticed a few people glancing at it, but only as if they were checking the time. Could the man be another dreamer? Not a malevolent drifter, unless he were a spy trying to pose as one of the populace, but simply a curious traveler like Emily, perhaps even one of her friends. But how could a foreign traveler, friendly or not, have understood the true purpose of the clock? Maybe he'll show up tonight, and I'll have a chance to talk to him again, said Will, throwing back the sheets. That night, Will stepped into his world where he'd left it, on the western side of the upper terrace of the garden. What time is it? Was his first thought. Unable to see the clock tower from here, he pulled out his pocket watch, which, again, he'd managed to bring with him, and checked the time. 1 o'clock, he observed. But where? Was it 1 a.m. in the waking world, or 1 p.m. here? After a quick glance up at the sun, he faced north and looked down at his shadow, which was quite short and fell straight in front of him. It should be close to noon, he thought. So, wagering it was more likely that the watch was displaying the time in the waking world, he reset the hands to 12. As soon as Will pushed down the stem of the watch and felt the click, bells began to ring. For a moment he cringed. They seemed to be the same bells that had sounded on the day of the drifters' attack. But as he listened, he heard their message. These were not alarm bells warning the town of danger. They were celebratory. It was noon in Wysteria, and the festival had just begun. Will hurried over to the doors and pulled them open. A stream of people moved up the street toward the square, which was already bustling with activity. From here, he could see the top of the clock tower peeking up above the wall. Both hands on the face pointed to 12, in agreement with the time on his watch. But did the clock read 11:50 10 minutes ago? He asked himself. Probably not. Will suspected that today, like yesterday, and every day before, it was noon when he'd first arrived, and that only when he reset the time on his watch did the sun begin to move. Then, what happened while I was gone last night, he wondered, watching the clock, waiting to make sure the minute hand was, in fact, moving. It was dark when I left, so when did the sun reappear? Was there a sunrise this morning? Or did it stay dark until he arrived, at which point the world automatically reset to noon? I suppose I could ask someone who is here, he thought. But would any of his citizens even understand the question? Perhaps, given their nature, they didn't notice changes that occurred in their environment. Or perhaps they did, but simply accepted their world as it was, without wondering how or why. Then, seeing that the hands on the clock no longer lay atop each other, he began making his way to the plaza. When he reached the gateway and stepped into the square, Will was greeted by cheers. Those who held tankards raised them high, toasting him before draining their contents. With a broad smile and a wave of his arm, he acknowledged the enthusiastic reception from the crowd. Where did they all come from, he wondered, as his citizens returned to whatever form of merriment they were engaged in before he entered. Talking with friends, singing and dancing, eating and drinking. Had they always been here, living in the unexplored neighborhoods of the town? Or had he given birth to them overnight? Regardless of when they'd become part of his world, they were now enjoying their lives, or at least their existence, and Will had little doubt that they would go on celebrating if he were to leave. Today, the breeze carried the fragrance of the flowers through the plaza. It was a delicate scent, like honeysuckle, but softer. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply through his nose, filling his lungs with the perfume. Such a tangible aroma, he thought. It feels the way it smells. Cool, slightly moist, refreshing. Will could taste the smell on his lips, and, strangely enough, he even had a vague sense of what it might sound like. Then, a new scent, more complex, caressed his cheeks and stirred his mind. Red roses, he whispered, sniffing the air. And lilacs. Will spun around, half expecting to see Emily standing right behind him. There was no immediate sign of her, but as he scanned the faces in the crowd, he noticed a young woman staring at him. She was wearing a bright pink dress, sleeveless, with a short, full skirt gathered into the tight-fitting bodice, which buttoned up the front. Her hair was jet black, bobbed, with long bangs and a purple streak on one side. She smiled at him and winked. Who is that? Thought Will, caught off guard by the girl's odd appearance. The young woman then began walking straight toward him. Unsure how to react, Will opened his mouth to speak, without knowing what he intended to say, when suddenly, from behind the advancing stranger, stepped Emily. "Good morning, Will," she said, grinning. She then took the girl's arm. "Don't worry, she's with me." When they reached Will, Emily released her friend and threw her arms around him. "This is wonderful," she said, giving him a small but sweet kiss on the lips. "What a transformation." "I'm glad you like it," he replied. "And there's more." "Another surprise?" said Emily. Will smiled. "Maybe," he said, kissing her forehead. "We'll talk later." "Will," she said, stepping back next to her friend, "this is Charlotte." Emily's guest then moved forward. "It's a pleasure," she said, presenting her hand as if offering it to be kissed rather than shaken. Will took her outstretched fingers, but hesitated for a moment. He felt rather awkward kissing another woman, even her hand, with Emily standing there. However, she was Emily's friend, and it seemed the polite thing to do. So he lifted his hand to his lips and kissed it, though as lightly as possible. "Pleased to meet you," he said. Charlotte was a lovely young woman, in her mid-20s, though Will initially would have guessed younger, in part because of her outfit. Her eyes were a vivid shade of blue, and her complexion was fair, both of which were accentuated by the dark eyeshadow and deep red lipstick she wore. Will lowered her hand and started to let go. but Charlotte held on. She looked into his eyes and smiled, somewhat flirtatiously, it seemed to him. Caught in her gaze, he felt something, an emotion, warm and pleasant, as if... She winked, then released his fingers. Emily told me it was a party, so I wore my party dress, she said, explaining her attire. Emily laughed. Very cute, said Will, smiling. Actually, her dress reminded him of something a 6-year-old girl might wear to a friend's birthday party. And shoes to match, he noted, looking down at her black combat boots. Yes, my little glass slippers, Charlotte responded. She then lifted one leg and stamped down hard on the pavement, as if trying to shatter her sturdy footwear. Emily giggled and shook her head. Speaking of clothes, she said to Will, I'd like to change into something more appropriate for the occasion. And you should too. Yes, you're right, he replied. I feel too much like an observer. Good, she said, taking his arm. She then told Charlotte about the clothing shop and asked her if she wanted to change as well. Yes, I think I do, said Charlotte, glancing around the square. I feel like getting into the spirit of this place. What do you call it, Will? I think Emily mentioned a name. Wysteria, he said. Ah, yes, Wysteria. Charlotte thought for a moment. Charming, she said, as is the world, and its handsome maker. Okay, let's go then, said Emily, pulling on Will's arm. I want to join the party. And we will return very shortly with part 2.